So for last week's discussion, you guys had some really fascinating flyers, advertisements, pages, you name it, that you shared with the rest of the class as you talked about the works every time layout. And I really enjoyed the discussion that you guys engaged in. So there were just a couple of points that seemed to come out of our discussion that I wanted to wrap up. And the first one is sin number 1, centering everything. Early on in the week, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not that's actually a good thing or a bad thing and why we should or shouldn't do it. So here's a hint. This week's reading will work with you on that to some extent. So that is sin number 1 in terms of the sins of layout that we'll talk about in this class. And you'll find a brief description of that sin on page 33 of White Space is Not Your Enemy. Now, it's not to say that centering everything is a bad thing all the time. It's just a very common, easy way out that many amateur designers take. They don't have to think about the whole design or layout. They just slap the text up there, make it centered, and off they go. There are some cases where centering might be a good idea, but it's up to you as a designer to decide when, where, and how. But that leads me into the second point that came out of our conversation, and that is, do we have to follow every rule? The Works Every Time layout is a simple guideline to help designers. It's a great, easy tool to use. But I want you to think about if you're good at something else in life. Maybe you're a great cook. Maybe you're a painter or an artist. Maybe you like to do carpentry work. Think about the steps that you skip when you're working on a new project. You're good at it. You don't have to think about it. You know what works and what doesn't work. So ask yourself, do you have to follow every rule of the Works Every Time layout? A number of you had the same comment, that perhaps it didn't have the right margins, or perhaps it didn't have actual copy text on the layout. But yet, it still worked, didn't it? So that's not to say that you have to follow the Works Every Time layout, or that you have to follow every rule that we have out there. These are guidelines that we've come up with through trial and error that work. So that's why we use them. But that doesn't mean you always have to follow them. And sometimes we don't think about how we can get lost in the design. So that's actually the last bullet I have on screen here. Some of you commented that you saw a great example that you wanted to share with the class, but then by the time you started digging into the comparison and using that Works Every Time layout, you got lost in it. So we have to be careful about that. Sometimes as a designer, we get lost in the design and we get too wrapped up in following the rules that we forget that we're just trying to convey a message. And last but not least, the role of fonts. Some of you commented on this a few times, how it was difficult to read something that was on the screen or part of that layout because the font was too small or the font wasn't correct. Maybe it wasn't so much that it wasn't correct, it just was difficult to read. So that's something we'll talk about later this semester, and since it got brought up, I wanted to bring it up here. So on screen, you just see a couple of examples of wartime posters. These images are actually taken from Save Bread, home front posters of the Second World War. It's by Susanna Walker, and it's from Shire Library. It's a very interesting small book that I love using in this class because if you look at those, very clearly they don't always follow those Work Every Time layout rules. Yet, as far as wartime propaganda goes, they were effective in conveying their messages. For those of you who like to follow pop culture, you'll even notice if you pick up this little book that it has Keep Calm and Carry On. It's on page 46 of this little book. The book actually retails for $12.95. I'm pretty sure you can find it on Amazon or any bookseller. But it's a nifty little book if you're curious about design in its many forms, especially during the Second World War. Use the on-screen navigation to access another section of this week's overview.